Hello, my name is Annie Rogers, and I'm the general manager here at ADDitude. Thank you for joining this event today called Mental Health Out Loud. It's a new type of conversation where the editors of ADDitude, along with some leading experts in the field of ADHD and mental health, will speak out loud about the topics that are still too often kept quiet and hidden. Today, we are here to discuss what are arguably the two greatest threats facing our children today: gun violence and a sweeping mental health crisis. These threats are pervasive and alarming in the United States, which is where ADDitude is based. But today's conversation is not meant for parents in America alone. With help from our esteemed expert, we will talk today about the worries weighing heavily on the minds of caregivers around the globe. Specifically, we'll talk about secondary vicarious trauma facing kids today, as well as anxiety, numbness, and how to navigate all of the above without A, trivializing our kids' fears, B, exacerbating their fears, and or C, straight up lying to them. Today's conversation is about youth mental health. We will talk about the ways that our kids' psychological well-being has been compromised today. We will not be talking about mental illness as a cause for school shootings. According to the National Council for Behavioral Health, mental illness is responsible for just 4% of violent acts committed in the United States. Instead, research shows that individuals with mental health conditions are more likely to be the victims of interpersonal violence than the perpetrators of it. Helping us navigate this very nuanced and important conversation today on mental health is an esteemed friend and contributor to ADDitude, Dr. Sharon Saline. Aside from authoring ADDitude's summer issue cover story on perfectionism and a positive parenting column on shame in kids with ADHD, Sharon is a clinical psychologist and author of the award-winning book, What Your ADHD Child Wishes You Knew: Working Together to Empower Kids for Success in School and Life. And she's the creator of the ADHD Solution Deck. She specializes in working with children, teens, and emerging adults, as well as families living with ADHD, anxiety, learning differences, high-functioning autism, twice exceptionality, and mental health issues. In her work as a clinical psychologist and educator, clinician, and consultant, Sharon assists in guiding families and adults toward effective communication and closer connection. She lectures and facilitates workshops internationally on topics such as ADHD, anxiety, and the teen brain. Sharon's a regular contributor to ADDitudemag.com and psychologytoday.com, among others. She's a featured expert on mass appeal on WWLP TV and a part-time lecturer at the Smith School for Social Work. You can learn more about her at drsharonsaline.com. Sorry. And let's see, before we start our conversation, I have just a few housekeeping items. Those of you tuned into this live event may submit your questions for Sharon at any time. Just navigate to the text box under the video player. We've also prepared a resource sheet that you can download now by clicking on the event resource section of your screen. And if you support the work we're doing at ADDitude, we encourage you to visit additudemag.com/subscribe and sign up for ADDitude Magazine. If you subscribe now, you will receive our fall issue, which features resources relevant to today's conversation, including articles on bullying, childhood anxiety, and how parents can talk to anxious children about school violence. Sharon, thank you so much for joining ADDitude for this urgent and important conversation today about youth mental health.
Well, thank you so much, Annie, for that beautiful introduction and for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Oh, thank you. So I will kick it off. In December 2021, the U.S. Surgeon General issued a public advisory regarding youth mental health crisis in America. It took root before COVID, but it's grown even more severe in the last 2 years. So we know that roughly 1 in 5 children ages 3 to 17 in the US has a mental, emotional, developmental, or behavioral disorder. And 1 in 3 high school students report persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. Sharon, how are you seeing the mental health crisis in your private practice and in the questions that you receive online and in your speaking engagements?
That's a great question. I think we are all, whether we're 5 or 50, stunned by the onslaught of events of the last several months or in the last 2.5 years between COVID, the war in Ukraine, the increase in gun violence that we've been seeing. Everyone is stressed, more stressed than usual. And so that there's a kind of pervasive feeling of insecurity for adults and for kids. And so what I'm seeing is that while children are struggling, I also see adults struggling. And I want to start this conversation by focusing on you, the adults who are tuned in right now, because I'm grateful that you're here. Our kids pick up how we're doing. They have this amazing antenna that can absorb our stress, that can notice when we're feeling worried or we're a little bit off balance. And so in this time when a lot of people are feeling powerless and some sort of helplessness, our kids will pick that up and they will take those emotions and increase them. And so what we want to do first is manage ourselves. And if you know my work and you've worked with me before, you know that the first of my 5 C's that I discuss in my book, and my card deck, my website, etc., is self-control. And what I mean by that today is that you need to process your reactions first before you attempt to talk about things with your kids. So you may feel shut down. You may feel incredulous, enraged, or devastated. If you are a survivor yourself or you know someone who is, you may be overwhelmed with re-experiencing your own trauma while trying to manage your kids' reactions. Talk about what's going on with you with someone who cares, who understands, and who will offer you the support you need. A friend, a relative, a partner, a coworker, or a therapist or a coach. Due to the widespread and immediate accessibility of news through social media, you may need to limit the time that you spend in front of a screen to titrate your exposure. It's normal to feel a sense of powerlessness, hopelessness, feeling blue, or just unsteady. So what we want to start with is by taking care of yourself, maybe delaying some major decisions, treating yourself with kindness and gentleness during this time when you're feeling more vulnerable, because that's really the key. Part of what I'm seeing in terms of how this mental health crisis is falling out is an increase in vulnerability and the, individualized responses to that vulnerability or defenses about that vulnerability, whether that's acting out behaviors, whether that's an increase in impulsivity, whether that's increased sadness or depression or anxiety, as well as a whole host of other kinds of responses. What we want to try to do is to maintain our curiosity about how our kids are doing without necessarily giving them direct advice about what they should do or should think. We want to we want to be a listener first and a responder second. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. We had a few responses in advance to this session where we asked people, what would you like what would you like to ask about this topic? And Sharon from Pennsylvania said, my 11-year-old has stated several times that he feels like he's going to get shot. I assure him that it's very rare, but inside I myself am terrified of the state of guns in our country. I believe an assault weapon ban has to go back into effect. It's terrible, the stressors this is putting on our children. So, what I'm seeing in my practice and in the people I speak to is that both adults and kids are afraid of being shot. One of my clients, who's an adult and in graduate school, said, I'm feeling more anxious. I'm more nervous every time I go to the grocery store or I'm out in public. Another friend of mine who's retired said that she was feeling blue and she didn't really know why. So I think what we're seeing is a more insecurity, more fragility, more vulnerability, and whatever your go-to coping skills are. And normally, you're going to go to those as well immediately. Whether those are healthy coping skills, like some sort of distracting activity that's fun, like art or playing basketball or swimming or having dinner with a friend, and distracting activities that are not so healthy. Maybe that's using a substance like marijuana or alcohol, or to an excess, or engaging in risky behaviors if you're a teenager. So I think that what we want to talk about today is, how do you manage the stress? How do you talk about the trauma? And how do you deal with this persistent state of anxiety in which we are all living?
Yeah. So, given that, fragility and vulnerability that you mentioned, quite understandable, in ourselves and in our kids, how can we go about talking to them about these, senseless acts of violence in a way that, takes it seriously, but doesn't frighten unnecessarily everyone involved?
Mm-hmm. Well, Annie, senseless violence is complicated for everybody to understand because we don't have neural pathways in our brain to process it. It doesn't make any sense. So where is it going to go? There's just we sort of it runs. It's kind of sort of mulls around in our brain or circles in our brain, and we go over and over it, like, why is this happening? I don't understand why this is happening. I don't know how to process it. So that's because it's hard to comprehend why someone would do something purposefully to hurt strangers. And so, I think the first thing we need to do is really own and acknowledge, this doesn't make any sense. You're right. I'm confused by it. Of course, you're confused by it. Everybody is confused by it and deeply saddened. So we want to start with shielding young children who are in the lower elementary grades, and sharing more facts with children who are in the upper elementary grades. So before you say anything, you want to think about what you want to say and how you want to present information to your child based on their age and their developmental level. Children under the age of 10 can be frightened by headlines about school shootings or disturbing images related to this story or the war in Ukraine. And nonetheless, they may hear things from their peers. Kids are naturally curious and they'll read whatever's left around: newspapers, magazines, even emails that perhaps are sitting on your computer. So we want to try to really make a conscious effort to put away those sorts of materials, particularly with potentially upsetting images or taglines. We want to give kids a sentence or two summary about what's happened so they're informed but not scared. And it might be as simple as saying, someone who basically did something that hurt a lot of people who are your age. We don't understand why, but I want to let you know this is something you might hear about. Be more specific, even if you're comfortable with that. We want to answer their questions honestly, but not, extensively. We don't want to go too much into depth. They don't need to know a lot of the details that could upset them further. I encourage you not to watch the news or listen to the radio or a podcast out loud while they're within earshot that has something about this upsetting time. And if they hear what's happened from other people or express distress about it, then ask them questions and be able to talk when they approach you. You might want to remind them that right now, in this moment, they are safe. And that you and their teachers and the community are working very hard together to try to keep them that way. And here are some protocols that we've set in place. You've practiced them, maybe how to get under your desk or whatever your district is doing. So we also want to talk about the difference between reporting and tattling. If they see something that's concerning, what kinds of things would that be? And can they report those to a trusting adult? That's not tattling. Or if they see a child or hear that a friend is thinking, that they don't want to live anymore, who are you going to talk to share that information? Because that's not tattling either. That's reporting a concern. So we want to listen to their feelings and validate their concerns while exploring solutions together. For tweens and teens, they're going to be much more assertive in asking questions about the reality of their safety and what measures are actually in place in their school and in your community. They may very well have opinions about what's causing violence in society and whether adults are doing enough to actually make things safe. We want to discuss with them their ideas, have a conversation. We don't want to argue with them, but we just want to listen, explore, and talk with them about their role in terms of contributing to safety in their schools and in their social lives by following recommended guidelines, reporting threats or concerning behaviors in peers or concerning figures to, again, trusting adults. And to once again explain the difference between reporting and tattling or gossiping. Really explore with them, when is a time to let an adult know that you have a concern and how can you do that? With kids, whatever their ages are, want to maintain as normal a routine as possible so that their concerns do not fill up all the conversations or their brain space. Having that routine is very grounding for kids. So we want to sort of maintain what you normally do every day so that they know what's expected of them and you're trying to work on that. And of course, to discuss how to be part of a solution, particularly with tweens and teens. What activities at school or religious groups could they join that bring people closer together and serve the greater good, rather than sort of sitting back into the judgment and helplessness that, wow, this is a really messed up world. There's nothing I can do about it.
Wonderful. We did receive another question from a listener that dovetails with this topic. They wrote in to say, how do I help my 9-year-old deal with anxiety in light of all the horrible violence, both local and national? She tells me she's extremely nervous when she's outdoors, especially when around a lot of people.
Well, there's a difference between possibility and probability. So there's no actual guarantee or absolute guarantee that bad things will never happen. We cannot reassure our children or tell them that with a straight face. But what we can say is the probability is low. So we want our kids to know what resources they have in moments and what resources are available to them in such perhaps dangerous or stressful situations. For many kids, like a listener's child, the immediate reaction to a traumatic experience, whether you are directly exposed or you're hearing about it, is worry. I don't want to go to school. I feel scared to go into crowded outdoor spaces. I jump every time a car backfires. I can't sleep at night because of worry. These are all types of things that we might be hearing from kids right now. Now, we know that with anxiety, there is a tendency to interpret predictions as facts, a tendency to worry even in the absence of a genuine threat. And when there is a real threat, we know that anxiety creates a disproportionately huge reaction. So anxiety increases overwhelm and is associated with catastrophizing. So how are we going to respond to our kids' anxiety? We want to respond with validation and curiosity. The goal is to teach them some skills for self-soothing, effective coping mechanisms, and have conversations that reduce worry and foster resilience and confidence. So, one of the things that we do a lot, sort of as a knee jerk reaction, because we did this when they were very little, and then we continue to do it when they're in elementary school and beyond, is we try to reassure them. We tell them it's going to be okay, or we dismiss their concern. Don't worry, it'll be fine. Like, don't worry about it. Dismissal and reassurance are attempts to minimize concerns that actually diminish the validity of their experience. So what we have to do is validate their concern. What I hear you saying is this, worry is telling you blah, 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 and you can't handle it. Instead, what can you say we can talk back to that worry monster? How even we adults have those worry monsters. What can we say back to it that will help it calm down? And so you want to brainstorm a couple phrases for her to say to herself in moments when she's feeling afraid. Because things that we tend to do, which are to say, it's all right, I'll take care of you, isn't really right, isn't really helpful, because you may not be there. So what we want them to learn how to do is to say, I'm scared and I'm going to take a risk anyway. Or I'm nervous about this. I'm worried that something's going to happen. And what I'm going to tell myself instead is that. So we really want to be able to say, to be able to name the worry and the fear. I am afraid, I am scared, and here's how I'm going to respond to it in a more empowered kind of way. So there are key behaviors in students, regardless of age, that are going to raise our concerns as to the state of their mental well-being, i.e., is their anxiety something that needs particular treatment by a professional? We may see physical symptoms, we may see emotional symptoms, or social signs. So I created a little list of what these are. So we might see excessive worry, sadness, crying, irritation or withdrawal, inability to enjoy activities that they previously liked, poor eating or sleeping habits. And we know also that untreated anxiety can lead to depression. So these are signs you might see with anxiety, but you also might see them with some mild or more severe depression. Avoiding responsibilities that they were previously able to meet, some sort of regression. Any evidence of drug, alcohol, or tobacco use for older kids, being quick to anger, increased isolation, over-focused on screen time because it's a very high-value, distracting activity, greater trouble with focus and concentration than you would expect, unexplained headaches or other physiological complaints, stomach aches, tired, that kind of thing. And even perhaps some bullying, being the victim or the aggressor. So these are all things that we want to sort of observe. And when we see them, talk to them with our Sherlock Holmes hat on, asking accurate questions for information, or maybe talking with them and a third person, a trusted person at school, a teacher, a counselor, or even a therapist.
Okay. And we did have someone write in asking, has anxiety increased in children during the pandemic? I think we can say yes.
Yes. Yeah, we can flat out say there is much more anxiety as a result of the pandemic. In general anxiety for sure, but real specifically social anxiety, because most children lost a year of social development. They were engaging online, but it's not the same as being able to read facial nuances or get a sense in your body of feeling that someone might be upset with you. So some of those social skills decreased and social anxiety increased.
Right. And we see it anecdotally here at ADDitude almost every day. The reports from parents of their children experiencing signs and symptoms of anxiety have absolutely increased over the last 2 years. And the other the other thing that we're seeing quite a bit of is greater depression. So we got a
Yeah.
question here that kind of that actually touches on both, and I wanted
Mhm.
to inject it if I could, because I feel like this advice dovetails with what you were just speaking about, Sharon.
Mhm.
A listener wrote in to say that their daughter's been experiencing depression for about a year and a half.
Mm.
And she's at the
Mhm.
point where she can't tolerate any sort of correction, no matter how small.
Mm.
It triggers
Mhm.
her anxiety and she either explodes or shuts down. So
Mhm.
they're at the point where they're afraid to engage because they don't want to trigger her, um, don't want her to go over the top. And they're wondering if you can offer any advice for, they want to offer their support and love, obviously, but they're really struggling with how to best do that.
Mm. Well, I don't know too many specifics of this situation, but I certainly would encourage them to speak to their pediatrician about any kind of medical intervention, medication intervention. But I would also encourage them to really seek out a family therapist. Because as a parent, we have to be able to give feedback to our kids. That's part of our job. And so we want to figure out is in what way can she hear feedback and how much of it. And so my guess is that she hears a little bit and basically generalizes it, blows it up into a huge thing in her head instead of leaving it the size that it's actually really is. And so in when kids are very sensitive like this, when kids are showing signs of depression, what they're telling us is that they really have given up on themselves in some way. They feel ashamed of themselves. They're angry at themselves. They may be angry at adults who they feel like have misunderstood them or not been able to help them adequately. And so, for someone like this, I think it would be really important for them to actually see a professional to get help, and for you as a parent to have a conversation with your child and say, sometimes I need to give you some feedback. That's my job. Let's talk about how you can hear it without having a meltdown, because I don't want you to have a meltdown. And there's some stuff I need to talk to you about. So, what's the exact language I could use to talk to you? Like, what exactly can you hear? And then use that exact language. And if your child starts to activate and respond, to have a recovery clause. So if you start to react and respond, what we're going to do in that moment together is X. What kind of, you're going to have some self-soothing or something you're going to say to yourself, or both. A self-soothing activity, or a statement that will neutralize the situation. So you don't have to overreact in that way.
Okay. Um, and I think it's absolutely fair to describe, both the pandemic and school shootings as widely traumatic for many reasons. But maybe not in the way that most people think about trauma. The death of a
Mm,
parent, a life-threatening injury, kind of think of those fall under the umbrella of direct trauma. And it
mhm.
feels like what many of us are living through and parenting through is kind of a barrage of secondary or vicarious traumas that we don't experience directly. Can you help us understand the differences, different types of trauma, how ADHD plays into that, and how we can really best help our children heal from this, vicarious trauma as it's really ongoing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that secondary trauma is a very real thing through exposure, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. So there are three categories of trauma. There's acute trauma that results from a single incident of trauma that you experience or someone you love experienced, but it's a one-time thing, and there's almost an acute stress reaction that goes with it. There's chronic trauma, which is repeated and prolonged, such as domestic violence or abuse. But they're also part of chronic trauma is also systemic trauma, such as racism, homophobia, impact of poverty, sexual harassment, being neurodivergent in a neurotypical world can be part of that. Particularly if you're when you're being bullied, that would be a chronic trauma. A complex trauma is repeated exposure to different multiple traumatic events, often of an intrusive interpersonal nature, but not always. And what we see with trauma is that a person who experiences stressful or traumatic situations can develop what we call learned helplessness. And Dr. Martin Seligman coined this phrase. And according to the American Psychological Association, learned helplessness occurs when someone repeatedly faces uncontrollable, stressful situations, then does not exercise control when it becomes available, or turn to control when it becomes available. And so it's a behavior pattern that involves a maladaptive and ineffective response in avoiding challenges, we see it in avoiding challenges, negativity, and in the sort of the absence of useful problem-solving strategies when obstacles arise. Post-traumatic stress disorder, which is what we commonly think of when we think of trauma, some of the symptoms of that include insomnia, flashbacks, low self-esteem, frequent painful emotions, reliving the event, or perhaps forgetting it altogether. Hypervigilance, and separation anxiety in children. The treatment for trauma really varies. There's a range of clinical interventions and options based on what we now call trauma-informed care, which is, instead of asking, why are you acting this way, we ask, what has happened in your life that's led you to act this way? And culturally appropriate sensitivity, including community-wide healing. And in situations like what happened in Uvalde, there's something called critical incident stress debriefing tools that are often used. Typical core components of trauma-based interventions include things like motivational interviewing, risk assessment, addressing barriers to access for help, understanding the brain and attention, because when someone has experienced trauma, it affects a lot of the centers of the brain that are affected by having ADHD. And so those would be your executive functioning skills. So you'll have less emotional regulation, you'll have more reactivity, so less verbal and behavioral impulse control. So we want to work on teaching those, those skills, and particularly helping kids learn to manage big feelings. Trauma-focused interventions also may include reconstructing the narrative about the trauma, building relapse prevention skills to maintain the gains made in therapy. And the therapies for trauma that are, most highly sought after and rated are trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing therapy, something called EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprogramming, prolonged exposure therapy, somatic therapies, internal family systems, play therapy in particular for kids, or art therapy can be helpful, and psychodynamic and family therapies.
Okay. You mentioned greater reactivity and greater emotional dysregulation, and those make a lot of sense to me as responses to trauma. But I'll tell you, we are hearing quite a bit from teachers and parents who are describing kind of a different phenomenon, specifically in the wake of the Uvalde shootings, and that's numbness. So we're hearing that their kids and their students, they appear almost unfazed. They're going about their normal lives. Now, of course, it's a busy time of year. There's a lot. We wouldn't, there are celebrations that should happen, of course. But parents are worried that they are becoming desensitized. Is that also a reaction to trauma? And how might parents respond to kids who don't want to engage in these conversations, um,
Mhm.
who are resisting it either, you know, almost by ignoring it or by having some adverse response to engaging in talk of the violence?
Mhm. Well, according to the American Psychological Association, about half of all children experience a traumatic event in their lifetime: abuse, violence, terrorism, disaster, or what we call traumatic loss, with many experiencing more than one such event and others living with chronic trauma with no time for healing between events. Most kids experience acute distress after exposure to a traumatic event, and reactions differ according to age, of course, maturity, what the history to chronic trauma might be, and ethnicity. So, compartmentalizing or avoiding a topic, that numbness that you're seeing, could be healthy as a response. It's just, I can't process this. I don't want to talk about this. It's too upsetting. I don't want, it's just too much for me. Or it could be maladaptive. Because when there is a way in which when you experience trauma, whether you experience it primarily, like it's directed toward you yourself are experiencing it, or you experience it vicariously, it's overwhelming and it can be flooding. And that's part of the challenge, particularly for kids with ADHD, because kids with ADHD often struggle with working memory, and working memory and emotional regulation are inherently linked. Because with working memory, what we want to do is pull up an experience from the past that we can apply to our current situation. And when kids process information more slowly, or they struggle with working memory, they can't access that prior memory. And if you throw in anxiety, which erases memories of success and effective coping, then they're really at a loss here. And so they just become the gates are open and they're flooded by these intense feelings. And so it could be a healthy choice to say, I don't want to talk about this. Like, I can't deal with it. On the other hand, they may be flooded by these feelings or just so perplexed and overwhelmed by them that they can't actually figure out how to to process it, where it's supposed to go. And so what we want to do is to observe our kids and see how they are acting, and rather than ask why questions or kind of push them to talk about what's going on, wait for them to initiate a conversation, and then ask questions beginning with what and how. What are you thinking? How does that affect you? Rather than why, which is more difficult often for people to answer. When kids are engaging in acting out behaviors or more atypical behaviors that are demonstrating kind of shorter fuses and more reactivity, then it would be natural to have a conversation out of that, to reflect on. I'm wondering if maybe you're feeling more sensitive, or to because of what's been going on. I know that I've been feeling very distressed. What do you know about this? Are your friends talking about it? What are you talking about? That kind of thing. You might want to add an extra check-in at a family dinner. I'm a big fan of a high and a low, or a thorn and a rose, or a rose and a thorn, excuse me, or a happy and a crappy, to get a sense of where your kids are and what's happening with them, kind of to gauge how they think they're doing and what's important to them. Kids may very well be more distracted, particularly kids with ADHD, because they don't have the capacity to modulate their feelings, or their sort of impulsive responses or behaviors as part of having ADHD. So they might need additional assistance, or sometimes you'll see some regression and you're like, didn't we deal with this 3 months ago? Why is this back now? Or 6 months ago? It's back now because they're feeling stressed. So rather than chide them for it, we want to just say, okay, Yeah, just hold it in your head as a parent. My child is feeling stressed. Let's see, how we can regroup. So really, I think the thing is to be patient. I do want to say that trauma informed care, there are 4 R's of trauma informed care. Realize the widespread impact of trauma, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma, respond instead of reacting by using validation and de escalation skills, and resist re traumatizing by really learning and practicing stress management and relaxation skills to cope with distress. So that would mean any kind of breathing, body based activities. Exercise is a great way to cope, walking the dog, going for a bike ride together, things that can help create endorphins in your brain, which will counteract the cortisol of the stress reaction.
That's a very helpful reminder for all of us. You mentioned quite a few sort of hallmarks of ADHD that can complicate trauma: emotional dysregulation, working memory challenges, anxiety. And it makes me think that of Dr. Nicole Brown. She did a recent ADDitude webinar and pointed out that trauma and traumatic stress impacts the same area of the brain as ADHD. And she said in that webinar, quote, "Children who experience traumatic stress also have difficulty concentrating and learning in school. They're also easily distracted and often don't seem to listen. They can be disorganized and show hyperactivity. These are all the same symptoms that you see in children with ADHD. This overlap actually complicates ADHD assessment." And I just wanted to read that because I think it is an important reminder for caregivers and educators that traumatic stress and ADHD may manifest in similar ways. And I just wanted to follow up and see, are there special things that we should be keeping in mind and differentiating our responses, trying to tease this apart and respond in the most helpful way for these kiddos with both ADHD and traumatic stress?
That's a really great question. I think that the part of the brains that are affected, there are different organs, but this also has to do with that prefrontal cortex. But complex trauma, in particular, or acute trauma, both of them follow specific events. Chronic trauma also has specific events that are recurring over time. So let's look at some of the differences between ADHD and trauma. So ADHD is a largely inherited condition. We know that about 50 to 55% of adults with ADHD have a child or more than one child with ADHD. There are smaller, less developed and less active brain areas that have to do with often lower amounts of dopamine and norepinephrine. We'll see deficits in sustained attention, behavioral inhibition, and of course, regulation. And we'll also see pervasive symptoms of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity that can cause, pretty significant functional limitations. And for PTSD, we see traumatic events that cause brain changes. They're not inherited. And the majority of trauma-exposed children may or may not meet the criteria for PTSD. You may have chronic trauma, but you may not meet the criteria for PTSD, which is interesting. PTSD involves 3 primary processes: re-experiencing, avoidance, and hypervigilance. We don't see those with ADHD. And PTSD includes physiological, cognitive, and emotional changes in how a person processes stressful information and stressful situations, versus the more pervasive symptoms of inattention, hyperactivity, or impulsivity that we see in ADHD. Of course, there is an overlap. Both of them share difficulty concentrating and learning in school, easily distracted, may not seem to listen, may be disorganized or hyperactive, may be restless, and may have difficulty sleeping. The difference is that with trauma, you continually feel like you're on alert for threat or danger. Sometimes there can be a kind of dissociation, a feeling of unreality or being outside of your body. You might feel guilty or ashamed, particularly if you've been the victim of abuse, that you've done something to cause it. Um, um, and there are feelings of fear and helplessness, uncertainty and vulnerability, and increased arousal and agitation. All of those we see with trauma. With ADHD, we see difficulty sustaining attention, struggles to follow instructions, challenges with organization, prioritizing, or planning, more fidgeting or squirming, perhaps some excessive talking, or not necessarily being aware of how you're impacting other people, losing things that you need, and interrupting or intruding upon others. So the symptoms are different. We can see irritability with ADHD, of course. We can see anger with ADHD, of course. And we definitely see feelings of shame with ADHD. The source and the cause of those feelings are very different.
Okay. We did receive two questions, both from mothers of children with ADHD who had recently experienced that more direct trauma. So these children have both recently lost their fathers.
Mm.
And
I'm sorry.
I can only imagine. Right. Yeah. Those mothers, and of course their questions were both asking for help for their children because mothers are amazing. But I wonder, in this case where they are likely experiencing an overlap of trauma and ADHD, advice for those moms who are navigating their own grief, their own trauma, and they're also trying their best to help their children.
Mm-hmm. I think those situations where the family has experienced a trauma really speak to some kind of family therapy to process the family's grief, and to offer support to members of the family about that. Obviously, individual therapy can be useful too, particularly if someone really is ready to talk about it. But what we want to think about is how can we, support our new family? How can we grieve? Because everybody grieves in a different way. And how do I allow for you to have your grief and that's different from mine? And they're both valid. So what we want to try to do in terms of helping your child is first understanding that we're all grieving and we've all lost a person who meant so much to us in different ways, and not be judgmental about the choices that people are making or how they're coping. Actually, I think the rate of divorce between couples who've lost a child is well over 80%. And a lot of that is because they grieve differently and they're mad at each other for how the other person is grieving, or maybe the child held them together in a particular way. So, we want to be able to remember the deceased with positive feelings. May their memory be a blessing is a very something said in Judaism. And so to be able to talk about the person who died with some laughter, with some joy, acknowledging that you wish they were here at a particular moment, or listen to your kids, wish that the person was here. If a child sees a parent grieving, it's going to be harder for the child necessarily to share their own grief because they don't want to further distress a parent. And so, what we want to do is to try to normalize. Yes, you're going to feel anxious. Yes, of course, you miss your father, and that they may not want to talk about it. They may be okay with just trying to live their lives. A lot of kids who lose a parent are really focused on just trying to live their lives and move forward. They're not ready yet to process the loss, and that's okay. But I do think that it's really valuable as a family to see someone, because your family is going to reconfigure in some way, and it's helpful to have someone to assist you with that.
Okay. Wow, that is a staggering statistic about couples divorce rate.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
don't hold me to it, because you're gonna Google it as soon as this is over and say Dr. Sharon was so wrong, but it's very high. Maybe it's
Wow.
7 out of 10. It's very high.
Wow. Okay, we have enough time here at the end to take some questions that we've received from listeners. And the first one is from a mother who says that her 7-year-old is maybe not even aware that Uvalde happened. It doesn't know about the school shootings. Should they bring it up?
Nope.
Okay. Let them lead.
Let them lead. I mean, I feel like a 7-year-old doesn't necessarily have to know that there was that shooting. What's the point of them knowing that there was a shooting? If they bring it up, for sure. If you feel compelled that you want them to know, in case someone else tells them incorrect information, then you might want to have a simple statement like, just so you know, a few weeks ago, something bad happened at a school in Texas. People are dealing with it, and then they're going to ask you, well, what was the bad thing? And so you have to have a response to that, which is, well, someone, you have to decide how much you want to tell your child. And you may say, I don't really want to go into what the bad thing was. Let's just say it wasn't a good, it was very sad. And, but I don't want you to hear about it from other people. So that's a real personal decision that a family has to make. But if your child is happy and so far 3 weeks later hasn't heard anything about it, I'm not sure why you would introduce it at this point.
Good. The other comes from a bit of the flip side, and that's I'm guessing a family member, but a concerned loved one who said that they're seeing a parent who is catastrophizing, and that they are having an effect on their adolescent.
Right.
How to intervene.
So that goes back to what I was talking about that, like the satellite dish that picks up on whatever your parent is doing. So kids, Lynn Lyons wrote in her book, Anxious Kids, Anxious Parents, like that there's a direct link between anxiety in a parent and a child. And in fact, kids who are raised by anxious parents are more susceptible to anxiety and to perceiving neutral events and neutral situations as threatening. So I think in the situation of this loved one who sees somebody catastrophizing, I would come to them with compassion. I would want to say, hey, can I talk to you about something? What I'm noticing is that you're clearly distressed about Uvalde, and you're really worried about your own kids. And I see this when you do X, and I'm wondering, what the effect of that could be on your child, because what I'm noticing is that your child, who is, best friends with my child or my nephew or my grandson, seems more anxious than he used to be. I don't want to overstep here, but I'm concerned about you and I'm concerned about him.
Okay, that's very helpful and positive language. I think we have time for one last question. It's not directly related to school shootings per se, but rather someone who wrote in to say that their child who has both ADHD and oppositional defiant disorder, that they're sort of stuck in a cycle of ongoing trauma because it sounds like they are in family court. And so they have been seeing a therapist as well as advocates, but they just feel that there's not an exit, and they could use some guidance on how to help this child when the trauma is in fact ongoing.
Well, I'm not clear, Annie, if the trauma they're in family court. So are they in the process? Is the family court the traumatic event, or are they experiencing trauma in the custody of one parent? That is
it's an important
that's
nuance,
perpetuating the family court.
Right.
Because, obviously any child who has to go to court or whose parents are in court over custody negotiations is traumatized by that. Having your parents have the amount of anger toward each other and inability to cooperate and work together is very distressing to kids, really of any age. Nobody wants to see their parents argue, and particularly, with the kind of venom that a lot of kids see when things are in the family court situation. By the same token, if they're in family court, it might be because a parent can't take care of them anymore, and that's equally distressing as well. So I think that we want to look at the situation of what's happening. Oppositional defiant disorder doesn't happen on its own. It's really a relational, in my opinion, a condition that comes from kids, a combination of feeling very angry, very powerless, and extremely frustrated. And so we want to try to figure out where a child like this can exert some control, where they can make decisions about their life and about themselves, so they feel like they have some influence. Because if you're going through a situation of family court and you don't know what's going to happen, it's a very, very, very destabilizing experience. Think about yourself, Annie. Like if I said to you, well, you may have to move at any time. I don't know when that is, but, I'm not sure you're going to be able to keep living where you're living. And you'd feel nervous all the time and you'd be angry about it. And so, or if I said, oh, your parents are, I don't know. I don't even know what I was going to say, but let's say, a parent died and you and your sibling are arguing over the will. It's extremely anxiety provoking. And so you're not going to feel grounded, or you're not going to feel like you know how to manage what's happening in your life. And kids have limited management skills. That's why their executive functioning skills develop until the age of 25. And with ADHD, there's about a 3-year delay. So we really want to try to help them grow what is manageable and what they're interested in, and they feel good about, that they actually can do in sort of in opposition to, I know that's a pun on words, but in opposition to feeling, just really resentful and angry about their situation.
Well, we covered a lot of ground today. Anxiety, trauma, interventions, and this was an incredibly helpful conversation, so timely and full of resources. So Sharon, thank you so much for leading this and what was ADDitude's first ever mental health out loud event. And thank you everyone for listening and for joining us, sending us your questions and joining this conversation. Please know that a replay of today's conversation will be available on ADDitudemag.com, and we will email everyone who registered just as soon as that recording is available. We also hope that you will come back for another conversation. We are going to be speaking with Dr. Cheryl Chase next Thursday, June 16th at 2 p.m. Eastern on another related mental health topic regarding our children and teens. So thank you everyone for joining. And Sharon, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you so much. It was great to be here. Thank you, Annie. Thank you, everyone who attended.